Welcome to Anthro Dish Podcast, the show about food, culture, and identity. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Dugnan. This is a year marked by renewed interest in finding one's community, in many efforts to do good in one's broader network, or in making sense of fascism and political upheaval. In the food world, food justice activists have been spending decades working to increase access to healthy food in low-income communities of color across the United States. But despite their best intentions, these activities often perpetuate issues of food access inequalities and racial stereotypes. So how are these movements being affected by long-term misconceptions or assumptions around the communities that they work with? And what understanding of quote-unquote healthy food are they going in with? My guest this week is Dr. Hanna Garth, who's here to speak more to this. Hanna is a sociocultural and medical anthropologist and assistant professor of anthropology at Princeton University. She studies food access and the global food system. Drawing on 15 years of research with the food justice movement in South Central Los Angeles, her second book, Food Justice Undone, Lessons for Building a Better Movement, is out as of today with the University of California Press. She draws on this ethnographic research to understand issues related to justice and equity in multiracial communities. She studies these questions in Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as among Black and Latinx communities in the United States. Out of her food justice movement research, she also published and co-edited the volume Black Food Matters, Food Justice in the Wake of Racial Justice. She has also published the book Food in Cuba, The Pursuit of a Decent Meal, based on long-term research in Eastern Cuba, and several articles in top journals in her field. Hanna has also won a variety of awards for her research and service. In today's conversation, we're discussing some of the central themes in her latest book, Food Justice Undone, such as the roles of liberalism and whiteness in maintaining power structures and dynamics in food justice movements, the racialized differences in food justice work, and the power of language, statistics, and small moments in shaping the landscape and politics of food movements. Here's my conversation with Dr. Garth. All right, welcome to the show, Dr. Garth. How are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. I'm so excited to chat with you. I am a big fan of your work, so it is an absolute pleasure to have you here. Do you mind sharing a bit of background about who you are, where you're coming in from today, and the type of work that you do?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for your kind words about my work, and thank you for having me on the podcast. So I live in Princeton, New Jersey, but right now I'm actually at a visiting position at Chatham University. I'm on their Eden Hall farm-based campus. I'm here as a Rachel Carson visiting scholar, and it's been a lovely couple of weeks, like getting to do farm-based stuff and applied stuff and hands-on stuff. But I'm originally from Eau Claire, Wisconsin, which in the grand scheme of things is a small town. And I spent my formative years in my sort of preteen and early teen years in a town called Gaylord, Minnesota, which is very much a farm town. And then during high school, I moved to the suburbs of Minneapolis. But I would say that being in those farming communities really is the kind of thing that primed me for doing research in food and food access. Not because I didn't actually grow up on a farm, but when you grow up around farmers, you hear things about like fluctuations in commodity price and whether the flood or the drought is going to ruin the crop that year. And so it makes you kind of think about the ways that all of these little things are connected to a global industrial food system.
Yeah.
So I think that really influenced me from a young age.
I'm excited to hear you say that because I also grew up around a farming township where I also was not a farmer, but the language of farming really sneaks into everyday conversations in ways that you kind of take for granted too sometimes. So I'm curious in terms of how you bring that into your food research and your perspective on, food culture in general, because I find that something where quite often on the show, when we talk about food, we're talking about foodieism or yum sort of food stuff, right? So what are some of those considerations that that you bring through that perspective?
Yeah. I think, another element of growing up in those places is that I grew up with pretty low income working class folks who, sometimes would struggle to be able to afford food, even though ironically they're the heartland of America, sort of putting food on everybody else's tables. And so I thought about those kinds of issues a lot, like how farmers don't make a lot of money, and food is expensive. And it seems so illogical that you'd be in this place where people are growing so many things, but that you go into the grocery store and people are buying food it's got thousands of food miles and it's been highly processed. And that's what people generally ate and could afford to buy. And so I think about, like, I saw lots of different strategies for working around food insecurity growing up and seeing how people kind of struggled to put food on the table for bigger families. And so making those connections to kind of the micro level experience of the dinner table, connecting that to global structures and whether it's state or federal or international policy, I think that really influenced my choice to study food access and food access inequality for my doctoral work.
That makes a lot of sense. I very much see that element coming into how you're looking at the food justice movement. So do you mind sharing a little bit about the main theme of Food Justice Undone and how you can food justice movements within that as well?
Sure. Okay. So, Food Justice Undone Lessons for Building a Better Movement is my new book. It's basically studying the rise in people who coalesced around this idea of food justice, which I observe as happening in the kind of the early 2000s. I started doing the research in 2008, but basically the idea was that a food justice approach would get us something better than food charity or just thinking about food insecurity, because food justice would think about the structures that cause these inequalities and really kind of forefront the political and structural problems. And food charity and food insecurity concepts were critiqued by this population of activists as being too much about individual failings and too stigmatizing. So the hope was that a justice framework would really shift the narrative. And so I was interested and sort of compelled by the argument that this group of people were going to be doing something different. And food justice is something it's defined in a lot of different ways. And people think about it across all these different elements of the food system. So sometimes it's about farmer justice, sometimes it's about fast food worker justice, it could be about meat packing plants. But the group of people that I was working with were mostly interested in food justice in terms of equitable distribution of healthy food in the urban setting of South Central Los Angeles, where I worked. And a lot of people were inspired actually by two Los Angeles-based scholars, Bob Gottlieb and Anupama Joshi, who basically defined food justice or a just food system as one where the benefits and risks of where, what, and how food is grown, produced, transported, distributed, accessed, and eaten are shared fairly. And so that's a very complicated and somewhat clunky definition, but I really did see that the food justice activists that I was working with were utilizing that in their approach, or sometimes they would simplify that and essentially lean on how the USDA defines food security, which is that all people at all times have access to enough food. And so there were different approaches, but like generally the justice theme was wrapped up into those kinds of definitions.
And it's interesting because the fact that a lot of the activists that you were observing and working with in these spaces were very reactive to the idea of charity. It kind of seemed like that. And yet at the same time, you unveil that quite often a lot of their perspectives on the communities that they're working with almost mimicked or mirrored that idea of charity as well. At what point in working within this food justice community did you start to see the potential for this research where you could really look at how food activists are operating within these communities?
Yeah. Yeah. So I started to see it really early on. So this whole thing didn't start as a research project. It started just as me volunteering in community gardens and wanting to get my hands dirty and just like be in the soil and getting some fresh produce in the process. But one of the things I observed when I was volunteering with these different organizations in South Central Los Angeles was that the people that were volunteering alongside me all were mostly white, young people, often women, coming into South Central from other parts of the city. And there weren't a lot of residents that were involved in this work. And I was really perplexed by that. I was like, I imagined that the food justice movement would be more of a grassroots movement that was driven by the community and that I would be seeing community members doing the work. But that's just not what I saw at first. And so then I spent a lot of time trying to look for what I thought was sort of my idea of what a grassroots food justice organization might look like. And I did eventually find those people, but in the process, I worked with a lot of organizations that were run by what South Central residents call outsiders. So people who come from anywhere that's not South Central, don't live there, don't have connections to it. And I was really sort of fascinated by like why were so many people motivated to bring healthy food to South Central Los Angeles and kind of what was going on there. And that really drove the research questions and kept me searching for answers because they turned out to be very complicated questions to answer.
Hmm. Yeah, as I was reading through, I was like, oh, these are the types of questions that are so necessary and so quite often ignored or kind of like slipped under the carpet when talking about food movements, because quite often there's this idea of like an inherent good that we need to focus on, that there's this good goal that they're working toward. And you have this one line in the book that I loved, where you're talking about revealing this dark underside of good intentions is an outcome of the research, and critiquing the people in the movement is beside the point. So as you're navigating this with, the anthropological tools that you're bringing into it, how do you position yourself as someone that's working within this movement and also observing them and figuring out how they relate or don't connect to the communities that they're trying to serve?
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, that's also, I mean, the way you framed the question is complicated for me to answer. There's a lot of layers that are involved there. But I'll basically start with the fact that the people that I am ultimately critiquing, or more specifically critiquing the work that they do, are and were my friends. They're people that I lived around. They're people who, like, my kids were friends with their kids. I hung out with them. I went to parties with them. Like, they were part of my social network. And so I saw very clearly that for the most part, the people that are doing the work in this movement are not bad people. Like, a lot of people would say there's no such thing as a bad person. And yet they were doing things that produced really bad outcomes and at times were pretty racist. And so it I was constantly like really struggling with, how do I continue to do this research in an honest, and forthcoming way, but ultimately critique some of the people that have been my friends and are a part of my community. And so part of it was like doing a lot of work to not just cancel people or cast people aside, but to see how the systems that they're embedded in have put them in a corner, so to say, so that they're kind of feeling stuck and then become actually stuck in these same cycles that actually perpetuate the same kinds of inequalities that they set out to eradicate. So some of those structures are like their K-12 education and the fact that we don't learn a lot and we're learning less and less about racism, structural inequality, how histories of income inequality and redlining and retail redlining like continue to play out today. We don't have the capacity to have discussions about race and racism. And some people do, right? Some people make a concerted effort to develop that and be good at it. But what I saw again and again was that even people in rooms full of food justice activists who are having a conversation, the people who had the capacity to talk about the underlying problems would get sort of shut down, or somebody might explicitly just ask them to please stop talking about this topic because it's making them uncomfortable. And so those people, whether they knew it or not, had the power to really shut down conversations and force food justice activists into a corner where they were unable to really dig into and think about the kind of deep underlying problems that cause food access inequality. So there's multiple other layers that are going on in the structure of why people end up in these positions that they don't want to end up in. And I think that this concept applies not just to food justice, but it applies to a lot of industries and different lines of work. And so it's fascinating to see how we can get pulled into and stuck in doing all of this work and investing all of this time and money in something that not only doesn't work, but actually perpetuates the very problem we think we're trying to solve.
Yeah, hugely so, hugely so. I really, there were so many examples of like very character oriented scenes in your book that I thought conveyed that in such a good way. You know, I've been in many conferences where those conversations come up and those moments of people shutting it down or saying that they're not comfortable have also been there. So as soon as I'm reading it, you know, you're immediately brought back to those moments. So I'm curious if you could speak a little bit to those choices in terms of like how you were writing the book, because instead of taking that more like academic approach to explaining it that way, I feel like that character work was really refreshing as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. It's good to hear that it was refreshing or resonated with your experience. So to be honest, I really struggled with how to write this book. I literally wrote 7 drafts of this
Oh my
book.
gosh. Oh my gosh.
And there were lots of part of the reason why I struggled was like coming to the acceptance of how I would have to be critical of this movement. But another reason that I struggled was like, it's kind of related to the previous question, which is like, I don't want to just portray all of this as a bad thing because there's a more complicated than that, right? There's a lot of good elements, good intentions, there's elements from this movement that I want to see carried forward. And therefore, I want to write in such a way that people who are working in the movement or movements similar to this can see these moments that cause catastrophic problems, moments that I was there standing there with them and I know that they couldn't see it in the moment. They didn't know how to respond or didn't have the capacity to kind of digest what was happening, but I wanted to write in a way where you could see like if that person had just said something and not walked away, or if they had just asked another question or engaged the situation in some other way, there could have been all of this potential for dialogue and exchange and understanding. And so I try to show in these scenes that I actually witnessed what was going on in my head, which was basically like, why did they do that? Like,
Yeah.
why
Yeah.
didn't they just talk to the person? Yeah. So that's part of why I wrote it in that way.
I appreciate that because I think that's, you know, one of the questions that I was grappling with while reading it was that idea of like at what point is it an individual person's actions and at what point is it that movement and that structure that, you know, you spoke about how it continues to kind of create this system that's not necessarily functioned to help communities but kind of perpetuate those. So do you mind speaking a little bit in terms of like how you used anthropological theories in the book to really access those sorts of sticking points of navigating that?
Yeah. Yeah. So um I wouldn't have really been able to do the kind of analytical work that I'm doing in this book without a robust set of anthropological theories and ways of analyzing the world coming in. So I think the main thing that was crucial was understanding power and understanding how power dynamics play out on these different levels. I don't want to get into like the nitty gritty of all the theories of power. Uh, but basically, we have like very overt forms of power, right? Like the military and war. And we have more subtle forms of power, like the fact that I have to have a driver's license to drive, or that I'm supposed to go to work every day.
Yeah.
Those are quite subtle. But I was interested in even more subtle forms of power. I was interested in like the kind of power that like a manager at a fast food restaurant has,
Hmm.
or the kind of power that nonprofit worker has over the one nonprofit worker that's just below them in the hierarchy. And this kind of power isn't really explicitly discussed in anthropological theory, but we have a lot of little bits and pieces that I was able to pull together to kind of understand and make the argument that these little forms of power actually really matter. Like, it's not just that this individual is making this other individual's life miserable, but it's actually shifting the whole ethos and dynamic of what's going on. And so it took a lot of background in theory to understand and also to be comfortable making that argument, because I'm arguing against very dominant theorists in the field. I'm saying, like, no, power is more than these other things. It's also this thing that you said it wasn't. So that it took a while to get there and to like be comfortable making that assertion.
Yeah, yeah, it's a huge one. And it's, for a lot of people that work in these fields where they are exposed to these sorts of like softer powers, it can shape not only your day, but like your trajectory in life and like how you end up making sense of the world too, right? So it's the fact that you're acknowledging those, I think is huge for the field as well.
Thanks.
So throughout the book, you weave in these interludes and, you're flipping this idea of like the anthropological other that is so historically and contemporarily studied as well. So can you kind of share, the role that these interludes played and how they navigate the racialized differences that are occurring through the food justice movements?
Yeah. Yeah. So this research was always, from the very beginning, not about people from South Central. It was about the outsiders who come in and intervene. And the thing that they had in common was that they were all coming to South Central. So South Central was just a place where they were doing this work, and had a particular kind of imaginary for them. And so I did research on food justice activists, whether they from the level of executive director of organizations down to like the newest volunteer. And they were by and large not from South Central. Very few people from South Central. And I really wanted to tell the story of these outsiders, but it's very hard to tell a story of an outsider without understanding what they're outside of.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's also part of why I wrote so many drafts of the book, because when people read the book or read manuscript drafts, they were like, where's South Central here? Like, where's the people? Where's the feeling? Where's like the low income people that they're trying to intervene on are not in the book, or they weren't in the earlier versions. But I kept being like, but this book isn't about them. Like, the research isn't about the people of South Central. And so it took a long time and a lot of like arguing with people who had so graciously read and commented on earlier versions of the manuscript to finally be like, okay, I have to show the perspectives of the people who live there and have that help people understand why the outsiders are getting things so wrong. Um, and so that's how the interludes came in. As I was finishing this research, I started a new project, which is looking at households and families in South Central and how they get food and what their kind of everyday lives look like. And so I took some of the data from that study and put it in here so that people could understand like the reality of South Central that I was seeing, and why I was like, this really just doesn't square with what these food justice activists are thinking that life is like in South Central. So it was a struggle to figure out how to piece it all together, and make sense of understanding inside outside. And I think that speaks also to this broader issue in anthropology of like the expectation of who the other is.
Yes.
So when people read the book manuscript about the food justice movement in South Central, they were like, well, I'm assuming this is going to be about South Central residents who I'm assuming are poor, who I'm assuming are Black, who I'm assuming are Latino. And they were like very confused by the fact that my interlocutors are white, middle class people. They were like, you can't just write about those people.
Interesting.
And I was like, but I did. And so it just took a lot of careful writing to kind of pull along my anthropological colleagues with me to say like, hey, we can look at this set of people as a kind of anthropological other who's coming into this place and seen as outsiders by locals.
Yeah, definitely. And it strikes me too, because if you think about, the anthropological interest in looking at like digital online cultures and how easy that is for them, cat cafe cultures or things like that, kind of start to pop up. I've read ethnographies on like figure skating. Those are things that seem to make sense. But it feels like when it's turned kind of at them in a way, it becomes a very different conversation too.
Yeah. 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 And I think like a lot of people who have read it will say like, I see myself in these people, in the outsiders, or that is my student, or I have been that person. And so I think that's also part of what makes it hard to digest.
Yeah, definitely. But it makes it all the more necessary when you're embarking on research with communities, right? Like that's the work that has to be done before you can comfortably start engaging with a community and making a relationship with them too. So I want to talk about, you look at the idea of the food movements and connect them with like a liberal philosophy and approach. How do liberal and white perspectives shape the types of questions that these movements are asking and shape how they do their research or how they do their work?
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much for asking that question. Because this is another thing that, so throughout the book, I talk about how we have these words that we assume we're all sharing the same definition of, right? Like, I assume when I say justice, you're talking about the same thing as me. That is not the case. Like,
Yeah.
really not, for many, many words, not just the words I use in the book, which are justice and health. There's lots of words that we're all thinking of in different ways. And I think both liberalism and whiteness fall into those categories of like, we can think of them in a bunch of different ways. So in the book, I do talk about liberals as in people with a liberal political party affiliation, like a Democrat or a Green Party person. But for the most part, I'm not using the term liberalism in that way. I am using it in an academic definition, which comes from Enlightenment theories about how we should organize society politically. So it's the idea that we are socially organized based on mutual understandings and that we're all rational subjects, or that the people who
Mm.
are rational subjects can engage in a mutual understanding. And that what is a key tenet of liberalism is the ability to bracket off something that might make a subject different. So a core tenet there is that we all assume that we share the same set of rational understandings. And so it's this understanding that we are reasonable, autonomous, rational, private actors. And that is how many people within the food justice movement approach their work. And so I saw the philosophical tenets of liberalism play out when food justice activists would say things like, they would acknowledge like, okay, I know this is a structural problem, or I know race matters here, but we're going to just bracket all that stuff off because we're
Mm.
trying to just have a conversation about food and about healthy food. So we're just going to focus on the healthy food, and we can't think about these things that are too complicated, too deeply historically entrenched, too structural, and we're going to remove them. And then try to get people sort of on the same page about like, let's just focus on what healthy eating means and how to get healthy food into these places. And that practice is something that, again, it's like something that is just steeped into our society as a normal way of practicing democratic political decision making.
Mm.
So it's not like an individual failing, but it creates massive problems. And it's part of the structure that's causing movements like this to fail and to not be successful at actually addressing the structural problems. And the same thing with whiteness. So I probably really hit people over the head with the fact that I'm not talking about white people. I'm not talking about the actions of individuals. I'm talking about whiteness as all encompassing, like other scholars have called whiteness the weather
Yeah.
way of understanding the world, understanding power as it relates to white supremacy, i.e., the idea that whiteness and the things associated with it are superior to and more virtuous than anything that's not white. So that translates directly actually into a lot of food consumption behaviors. And so that's a really interesting thing that I saw. So I see people favoring whiteness, valuing things that are glossed as white or attached to whiteness, whether they are white people or not.
Mm.
Anybody can do this. And so that might be something like one of the examples I give in the book is that families in South Central might eat collards. There's a lot of assumption that families in South Central eat collards, but also my research shows that they do eat
Yeah.
collards. So that's one like that's one correct assumption. But the for some reason a lot of food justice activists would try to get people to switch from eating cooked collards to eating raw kale. Now, conceptually, though they're both brassicas, they share a lot of very similar nutritional components, but one is clearly a not white vegetable and one is a white vegetable.
Yeah.
And hopefully people can see this because it's very hard to like if you don't. I did have someone push back and be like, vegetables don't have race. I was like, well,
Well,
I know
yeah.
vegetables don't have race, but we do attach these kind of ideological bundles that are located in concepts like whiteness or not whiteness to particular objects. And kale is definitely something that falls
Hugely.
under the column of whiteness.
Hugely so. Yeah. Yeah. And even, when you're talking about the question of like what is healthy food that these people are asking in these systems, the question itself of what healthy food is can look so different depending on, who you are and your cultural background and your experiences and your socioeconomic status too.
Yeah. Yeah. I saw so part of it also is just a gross misunderstanding of what Black and Latino cuisine looks like. So I've seen people talk about how like they need to get Latino families in South Central to eat more vegetables, that they're eating like too much fried stuff, too many tacos, too many enchiladas, too many whatever. And I'm like, do you know that like the sauces and the salsas are made of vegetables?
Yeah.
And people don't because a lot of people who prepare those things at home are pouring a jar of stuff onto their tortillas and they actually are like unaware of what is in the jar.
Mm.
Whereas like most of the Latino families that I worked with in South Central, they're making their sauces from scratch. They are putting the vegetables in the blender and making sauces that are made out of vegetables.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of like different kinds of value placed on different types of vegetables. And so one of the things I saw again and again was the desire of the food justice activists to get people to eat raw vegetables,
Yeah. Yeah.
salads, things that our mainstream society understands as vegetables and healthy. And that was not like among the Black and Latino families that I worked with. Yeah, they would eat a salad, but the main ways that they were getting vegetables were in cooked forms and mixed into other things and with a lot of flavor and seasoning added and not raw.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is just one of many areas where there's this like big discrepancy between what is healthy, what is a vegetable. These are not clear answers.
Yeah, yeah, and very much coded as, like it makes me think too about like how food is prepared as like an inherently white kind of raw cold veg corporate salad versus, adding seasoning and oil in cooking or using frozen vegetables as well. Kind of those like tenets of like nutritionism or healthism really sneak into, or like not sneak in, they're like embedded into how these movements kind of think about food as well. So in terms of like you talk a little bit about health and wellness movements as a trend and how they connect into food justice movements that you were observing. So what happens when these forces collide and what might get lost in the process of that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. The food justice movement, as I studied it, was coming up at a time when the United States government was investing a lot of money in obesity reduction.
Yeah.
And that really critically shaped people because they were going after the funding that the government, and so the US government did it, but then other philanthropic organizations and other kinds of organizations followed suit. And so they would, in order to get that money, they would be looking at like statistics, the percentage of people who are overweight, the percentage of people with obesogenic diseases, the percentage of people who are eating the appropriate serving of fruits and vegetables every day, and frame their programming around that, around the desire to reduce rates of obesity, reduce obesogenic disease, and increase fruit and vegetable intake. And that had a really big influence on how justice played out, even if people conceptually knew, like, I'm just getting this money because I want to get this money to do my programming.
Mm,
It would still kind of seep into the work that they were doing and become like, as it was tied to their outcomes, become like something that translated into just telling someone like, eat one more serving of vegetables a day. And so that's really far from justice, right? That's
yeah,
really far
yeah.
from the initial definition of justice. But in some ways, like, it was necessary for these organizations to take that money to be able to do their work. So they kind of were like, I don't know what the saying is, but like they danced with the devil for a little bit in order to be able to keep dancing.
Yeah, yeah. And then it just kind of trickles into their thought without necessarily acknowledging that that's happening or occurring at the same time.
Yeah.
I'm curious to get your perspective because, when you talk about food justice at the beginning of this conversation and like how you were framing it up, it takes a much more like communal approach. And then what you're speaking to here, ends up looking at individual actions, choices, moralities. So, in terms of how the work plays out, do you see the movements actively renegotiating how they work with communities, or is it kind of taking on this individual approach to different community members?
Yeah. I think there's multiple scales of what's going on. So organizations will try to work with other more community based organizations. So they'll come together in meetings and talk about different kinds of issues, which I write about in the book. And the people from the more community based organizations end up representing the views of the community for these outsider organizations. And those experiences kind of serve as a proxy for working with the community. I think that that's really different from actually, getting into the community and like going through the everyday process of how people live and work and get food and all of those kinds of things. And the organizations that are more steeped in the community, they don't need to do as much of that work because they live in the community and they see people and they know what's going on because they're doing all these things in their community. And it's really hard to kind of translate all of the complexity of everyday life in a place like South Central in a 1 hour conversation with a whole big organization.
Yeah. Yeah.
They don't and beyond those kinds of interactions, they end up doing maybe some surveys or doing some work with schools, local schools, to administer the surveys or figure out like what people want and need. But many organizations come away with a relatively simplistic view of the problem, and then they end up designing kind of individualized behavior based interventions. So they might know that they're doing this, but they're like, there's nothing else that we have the capacity to do. So instead of really figuring out what's going on here, let's just do a cooking demonstration, or let's do a corner store conversion where we're getting fresh fruits and vegetables into the corner store. And there's a lot of mentality of like, we're doing something and we've got to do something, and
Right.
that's better than nothing.
But do they ever ask, what the community would like in those scenarios?
Usually not. So I, in the instances where I saw food justice organizations asking what the community wants, it was usually organization to organization. So it was not like a town hall or something where community members are just invited to a forum to speak, but instead it was like the organization representing the community's desires. And often, like, I'm thinking of one particular conversation where one community-based organization was like, we have all kinds of problems. Like, we have poverty, we live next to trash incinerators, we live next to the freeway, we have water problems, we have too much trash on our streets, like our kids' schools are not as good. And they just went down this really long laundry list of problems in the community. And they were trying to make the point that healthy food is just one small, tiny concern in this sea of massive concerns that their residents have. But the outsider organization took away the message that, like, there's so many problems that nobody could possibly solve them. So instead of thinking about all of these problems, let's just focus on getting people healthy food.
Yeah. Wow.
And that was the kind of thing that happened again and again, like a really kind of mismatch in what is being communicated across groups of people.
Yeah. So what do you think it takes to get more alignment in conversations? Thinking particularly about, those working within the food activist movement, what's needed on their end to kind of meet people in a better way, in a way that is going to be more conducive to relevant or like appropriate work in the communities.
Yeah. I get asked this question all the time. And I don't have the best answer. I think when I talk to the long-standing, more grassroots organizations in South Central, what they would say to this is like, don't come here unless we invite you here.
Yeah.
Like, we didn't ask you for help.
Yeah.
And we may ask you for help. And when we do ask you for help, listen to what we're saying.
Yeah.
And, a lot of people so there's a thing in the United States, I don't know if it happens in Canada as well, but where we teach our young people that it's important to do something. It's important to start an organization, to help people, to create something big that's going to have an impact. And I see this starting, like, I have a 12-year-old and he's already getting these messages from his middle school, like, you got to do something. And actually the response of most of the community orgs that are more grassroots that I work with would be like, please don't do something.
Yeah.
Please don't start another organization. Don't come in here and try to make it a better place, but instead maybe just work for us, volunteer for us, fundraise for us. Just like take a step back, sit down and observe and listen to what the organizations that are already there and have been there for decades are doing and what they need. That's kind of the best answer that I can come up with to that question.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very needed answer, and I feel like it needs to be said more. So I appreciate you taking the time to explain it as well. And I appreciate you taking the time to chat through some of the themes of your book. It's such a great book. Do you mind sharing where people can find you online if they want to follow along and learn more about your work?
Sure. I'm basically just on Instagram for social media, and it's at Garth, Hgarth. I have a website that I occasionally update, but that's about it. So follow me on Instagram.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Hannah. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
That was Dr. Hanna Garth. I've linked her new book, Food Justice Undone, and her social media in the show notes below if you want to follow along and learn more. You can also find all this at my website at anthrodish.com under episodes. Thanks so much for listening to Anthro Dish Podcast. Subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, or your preferred listening platform. If you like the show, please give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify to help get the word out. For more Anthro Dish, be sure to sign up for my newsletter at sarahdignan.substack.com or find me on TikTok, Instagram, Threads, or Blue Sky at Anthro Dish Podcast. I always love connecting and hearing from you and what you're thinking about food these days. Music production was done by Lucas Wojcicki at lucassound.com. Anthro Dish is produced in partnership with the American Anthropological Association. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll catch you next week.